So, albeit there's very limited evidence available from social distance scales, but they suggest that overt anti-Indian prejudice has declined. But make no mistake, the situation of American Indians, especially American Indian women, is under-researched. But like their counterparts in other minority groups and the dominant group, they're systematically paid less than their male counterparts in similar circumstances. Research is still unclear about the severity or extent of discrimination against American Indians, but institutional discrimination is a major barrier for American Indians and has been for ever. If there is one fact throughout the whole process, it's that right there. That is, institutional discrimination has been a major barrier for American Indians. We, of course, have to talk about the acculturation process. Amazingly, many tribes have preserved at least a portion of their traditional cultures. Approximately 20% of American Indians and Alaska Natives speak a language other than English at home, about the same percentage as the total population. Few, if any, people left who speak, there's few, if any, people left who speak only a tribal language. Troyer reports that only 20 tribal languages in the United States and Canada are spoken by children in significant numbers. If this pattern persists, American Indian languages will disappear as the generations change. As you can see here, the percentage of the total population that speak a language other than English at home. The Navajo have the largest percentage by a significant amount. We have to think about what this means, what this treatment over time means for contemporary American Indian / Northern Anglo-American relationships look like today. When we think about this, we think about religions, we think about value systems, political and economic structures. What do we eat? And how do we recreate? And what we see is that each pattern has been altered by the dominant group. American Indians have been considerably more successful than African Americans in preserving their traditional cultures due to the differences in their relationships to the dominant group. And the contact situation as well. Native Americans were autonomous when Northern Europeans arrived on these shores, and then they were conquered, versus being taken from their land, having their culture stripped from them, and essentially beaten out of them. Even though this is the case, a number of social forces are working against pluralism and the survival of tribal cultures. That idea of pan-tribalism we talked about earlier, which ultimately might threaten the individual identities of the tribes. And opportunities for jobs, education, and higher incomes draw American Indians to more developed urban areas, which essentially breaks down the solidarity of those tribes that might find their focal point on the reservations, even though the reservations are undeveloped. We're seeing recent increases in the American Indian population, which are partly due to higher birth rates, changing definitions of race in the larger society, and a much greater willingness of people to claim Indian ancestry. Changing birth rates is an interesting one. There is ample amount of evidence that the U.S. government had a sterilization process or sterilization program where they were covertly sterilizing Native American women of childbearing years back in the 1940s and 1950s, and so when those programs stopped, you can expect that birth rates and fertility rates would start to go up. As you can see, this percentage of county population self-identifying as American Indian, 40 to 97%. Some of the darker areas are out west, Alaska, of course, and there in that Four Corners area, when we saw in the previous slides that it was the Navajo Nation where 50% of the children speak Navajo in the home. Well, that's that Four Corners area there in Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. So that's not surprising that that's an area that identifies itself as Native American. Educational attainment for non-Hispanic whites, American Indians, and the 10 largest tribes in 2012. Non-Hispanic whites, of course, are getting the most amount of education. Looks like the Iroquois are a pretty educated group as well, but still, they're lagging behind. One positive development for the education of American Indians is the rapid increase in tribally controlled colleges. There are now 37 of them. As you can imagine, when the tribes control the colleges, the tribes control the content, and Native Americans learn about their own history, culture, and heritage versus that Anglo-American version of history that tends to be derogatory of Native Americans. These institutions are mostly two-year community colleges located on or near the reservations, but some have been constructed with funds generated in the gaming industry. So it's not just the tribes that are creating these educational institutions, and it's not just the federal government. You get some money coming from the gaming industry as well. They are, of course, designed to be more sensitive to the educational and cultural needs of the group. Tribal college graduates who transfer to four-year colleges are more likely to graduate than other American Indian students. So if you start out in one of these community colleges, I'm sure this is very similar for other populations as well. It's not just Native American learners that experience this, but if you start out at community college and then you move to the four-year institutions, you tend to do better. Questions always, did all of this political power that Native Americans were trying to gain in the 50s, 60s, and 70s actually result in political power? And ultimately did it result in jobs? Well, the ability of American Indians to exert power as a voting bloc is it's essentially limited by the size of the group. We know that Native Americans they possess lower levels of education. There's language differences. There's lack of economic resources, and there's of course factional differences within and between tribes and reservations. So activating a large group of Native Americans to vote en masse for something is hard to do when the numbers have dwindled to what they are today, and when there are still a lot of factions in the tribes. This, of course, was very similar to the case with African Americans. American Indians who hold white-collar jobs are more likely than whites to work in low-income occupations. And in 1992, Ben Nighthorse Campbell of Colorado became the first American Indian to be elected to the U.S. Senate. He served in Congress until 2005. One way you know your group is making some significant steps politically is when people like you start showing up in political positions of power. As is the case of African Americans, the overall employment rate for all American Indians is about double the rate of whites. For Indians living on or near reservations, however, the rate is much higher, 70 to 80% unemployment on the reservations. You can see why people want to escape the reservations. Median household incomes for non-Hispanic whites and all American Indians. Of course, non-Hispanic whites, median household incomes $56,525. As you can see, Native Americans fall about $15,000 short at the highest, $25,000 short at the lowest. Poverty, this is a persistent plaguing condition of how we've treated Native Americans. Median household income for American Indians, 66% of that of non-Hispanic whites. We saw that in the chart. Poverty rate for American Indian families is almost triple of non-Hispanic whites. 6 of 10 of the largest tribes have an even higher percentage of families living in poverty, and poverty rates for children show a similar pattern, with very high rates for the Lumbee, Navajo, and Sioux. One of the reasons that they're probably continuing to claim and hold on to their heritage and traditions. Some primary structural issues that we deal with assimilation. The rates of intermarriage for American Indians are quite high compared with other groups. The high rate of marriage outside the group for American Indians is partly the result of the small size of the group. Marriages with non-Indians are much more common in metropolitan areas, as you might guess, and they're all associated with higher levels of education, greater participation in the labor force, higher income levels, and lower rates of poverty. In the end, American Indians can be compared with Australian Aborigines. They were both colonized by Great Britain. Early relations between the English and the Aborigines centered on competition for land. The invaders pushed the Aborigines aside or killed them if they resisted. The contemporary situation of Australian Aborigines has many parallels to that of American Indians. The group is largely rural and continues to live on the land that is less desirable. Life expectancy for Aborigines is as much as 12 years lower than that of the general population, and they have less access to health care, and Aboriginal communities are much more afflicted with alcoholism, suicide, and malnutrition than the general population. All very similar to what has happened with American Indians. In the end, American Indians are growing rapidly in numbers and are increasingly diversified by residence, education, and degree. Some tribes have made dramatic progress, others have not, And the challenges for the future, as was in the past, is to balance out pluralism and assimilism.